On the 3rd of January, 1919, the New York Times included the following editorial, quote, "Where, or rather on whom, the responsibility for the grounding lies is now too soon to discuss, but it is a grave one, and its nature is hinted by the wonder why the steamer was so far out of her course, and why she went ashore, that has been expressed by the fishermen and other seafaring folk who know the nature of the bottom off Fire Island. The fog was the immediate cause, but it is not an adequate explanation, for several other vessels successfully found their way through it and into port."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Northern Pacific on Fire Island?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Northern Pacific, along with her sister ship, the Great Northern, had been completed in October of 1914 by the shipbuilder William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway Company. The two 8,255-ton ships were the largest steam turbine vessels to have been built in the United States at the time, and they were carefully constructed for their intended purpose. People would call them palaces, and talk about the passenger accommodations that were intended to carry up to 856 passengers, but the ships were also designed with the quick loading and unloading of freight in mind. The two ships were intended for the route between Astoria and San Francisco, and they would need to be able to compete with an overland train route that existed already. Speed was key for this, and both ships were able to travel at 23 knots, which would enable them to travel between the two destinations in about 25 hours when the weather was in their favor. The peaceful service of the two ships would not remain possible once the United States entered World War I. On November 3, 1917, the Northern Pacific was commissioned and joined the cruiser and transport squadron under the command of the United States Navy. She now had a new route, taking her from Hoboken, New Jersey, to Brest, France. In total, she would make 13 trips, transporting 22,645 troops to France, and carrying 9,532 troops back to the United States. The Northern Pacific had a relatively uneventful career as a troop transport, other than a severe outbreak of influenza during the 1918 flu epidemic, which ripped through the troops on board during her voyage to Brest during her September 1918 voyage. 7 lives would be lost to the epidemic before they reached their destination, and cots were put up in the corridors of the ship in order to accommodate the sick men. On December 25, 1918, the Northern Pacific departed from Brest under the command of Captain Connolly to return to the United States with 2,459 troops on board, 1,700 of whom were wounded. In addition to the troops, the Northern Pacific carried a Navy crew of 466, bringing the total number of people on board to 2,925. Gone were the days of the ship's boasted comfortable passenger accommodations for 856 people. With the need to transport troops of the utmost priority, the ship was filled to her true capacity. As the ship neared the coast of New York, however, conditions deteriorated. They were met with driving rain, strong seas, and fog. They were also far closer to shore than they should have been, though no one on board was aware of it yet. Several things would later be discovered during an investigation. The first finding was that Lieutenant Hunter, who was in charge of finding the ship's position on the 31st of December, had made incorrect calculations. This was because he was experienced as a navigator, but mostly in the merchant service. Though Lieutenant Hunter was not aware of it, he had not properly understood how the Navy did their calculations, and he had thought he had done it correctly. The blame for this would mostly be placed on the shoulders of Captain Connolly, who it felt should have checked to ensure that his subordinate truly understood how to do such an important task before completely entrusting them with it. It was also found that Lieutenant Morgan, who was on watch as the Northern Pacific neared the coast, had failed to inform Captain Connolly when the weather had grown rough around midnight, as the year changed from 1918 to 1919. For the next 2 hours, the Northern Pacific traveled what proved to be an incorrect course, in poor weather, until at 2:14 in the morning she struck a sandbar off of Fire Island and became completely unable to free herself under her own power. She was only 300 yards from shore, unusually close to shore for a Fire Island wreck. Usually, soundings would warn anyone who came so close that they were in danger and lead them to change course. That the Northern Pacific had gotten so close to Fire Island was a mystery that was never conclusively addressed. The troops on the ship had all been asleep when she ran aground, and when they felt the bump, most of them assumed she had docked and got up to investigate. One of the soldiers would later report that even after learning the situation, there was no fear among the men, only interest in what was going to happen. On finding that his ship was not going to be easily freed, and waves from the stormy sea were breaking over his decks, Captain Connolly sent a wireless to the offices of Rear Admiral Usher in New York City, telling them that his ship was in distress and would need aid. In turn, at 3 in the morning, the officers of the Rear Admiral sent a wireless Captain Tuttle at the Oak Island Coast Guard Station, who then called the Point Woods Station and the Fire Island Station, since the Northern Pacific was stranded between the two stations. Since the ship was not in immediate danger, and the conditions were rough, it was decided by the stations to wait until dawn to go into action. The waves were still high, and the fog was still thick, but at least they could now see what they were doing. During the night, the Northern Pacific had developed a strong list, which was enough to give the rescue crews a sense of urgency. The first hope of the Coast Guard was that they would be able to get a line to the ship, but even though they were able to attach a line to the forward funnel twice, both times it broke almost immediately under the strain of the rough weather. Meanwhile, the Navy dispatched at least 6 destroyers and as many tugs, as well as the hospital ship Solace. These ships arrived on the scene around noon, but none of them were able to get close enough to the Northern Pacific to provide any aid. It was reported that some of these ships came close to grounding themselves in their attempt to get close enough to the Northern Pacific. They were finally forced to stand off and wait for smaller crafts to reach the Northern Pacific so that the men could be transferred to them. The surf boats of the Coast Guard were certainly making the attempt. They had repeatedly ventured out to try to reach the transport, but each time they had been driven back by the waves. Every boat that came close to the Northern Pacific was met with waving soldiers and cheers from the deck. It was not until around 4 in the afternoon that a boat containing the Coast Guard captains of all 3 nearby stations, as part of its crew, finally reached the side of the Northern Pacific. With them, the boat brought a line which would finally allow a connection between the transport ship and the shore. They could now set up the breeches buoy, but Captain Connolly turned it down, saying that the Navy would take the men off the next day. For half an hour, the boat remained alongside the Northern Pacific, while the soldiers on the deck, ignoring the danger of adding to the ship's list, piled along the railing to call down to them. One soldier bemoaned that they had traveled 3,000 miles with no trouble, only to strike the sandbar so close to home. Another man asked that they tell folks not to worry about them, that they were having a Happy New Year. To prove it, he threw the surfboat crew down some turkey sandwiches. The men were indeed making the best of their New Year's Day. The band was playing, and some of the men were dancing on the deck despite the waves. The main concern of the men in the surfboat, as well as the Navy, was the impact that the wreck was having on the men who were wounded, but they were reassured that they were fine. One man, leaning on his cane, shouted to them that they were as comfortable as if they were at home. This allowed for more timed plans be put in place, and many plans were being made. The Navy had mobilized every small craft they could find between Babylon to Sayville, from ferryboats that were usually used for tourism in the summer to houseboats. This small flotilla was now at the ready to try to come alongside the Northern Pacific whenever called. Plans were also made to attempt to drag the Northern Pacific off the sandbar the next morning with the power of tugs and destroyers, if the weather had eased any. Meanwhile, an emergency hospital was established at the Bayshore Air Station, and a special train was sent from New York to Bayshore with doctors and nurses who slept on the train in case they were needed in an emergency. The Red Cross provided the emergency hospital with 3,000 sandwiches, 500 blankets, 500 sweaters, 2,000 packs of cigarettes, and enough coffee for 3,000 people. The owners of 500 houses along the South Bay offered their homes to the government to house men in if they were able to be brought to shore. Now it was just a matter of waiting until daylight. Freeing the Northern Pacific proved not to be possible the next morning. Though the weather was finally moderating enough that the boat crews could begin removing the men, by no means did that mean it was calm. The waves were still from 6 to 10 feet tall as they crashed on the shore, and on 3 different occasions, surf boats capsized, though thanks to the quick work of the Coast Guard men, no lives were lost. 3 of the men were pulled from the water unconscious, reportedly from the shock of sudden immersion in icy water. By the time darkness fell, 237 men had been taken from the ship, as well as 17 of the Navy nurses. Captain Connolly seems to have finally relented, because by evening, Breech's buoy was finally put into use and took off 12 of the men. No attempt had been made yet to remove any of the men from the hospital ward of the ship. It was hoped to wait until good weather, when they could be transferred to the hospital ship Solace, which was standing by. On being asked about the mood on the ship, the officers of the Northern Pacific reported that the men were peeved by the sudden termination of their voyage home, but not depressed. The evacuation of most of the wounded commenced on the 3rd. Things were now better organized, and relays of Coast Guard boats and anti-submarine patrol boats lined the side of the Northern Pacific, where rope ladders had been swung over the side to enable the men to climb down. The men were eager to get off and reportedly needed little assistance, in spite of their wounds. The men who had lost their vision had ropes tied around them as a precaution, in case they made a misstep on their way down the ladders. The men who had lost an arm or leg, however, refused to have ropes tied around them, and instead counted on the strength of their remaining limbs to hold them as they made their way down. By the end of day 2, 100 men had been transferred to the waiting destroyers, where they were brought to Hoboken. As the ships docked, they were met with a band welcoming them home. The only men who now remained on the Northern Pacific were the 350 men who were completely confined to their hospital beds with the worst injuries. Their situation could hardly be considered comfortable. The waves were causing the ship to pound and rock on the sand, and almost everyone but the Navy crew had now left. The wounded were finally transferred when the weather calmed completely on the 5th of January. They were lowered in wire baskets to waiting boats below, where they were then taken to the hospital ship Solace, which had stood by the entire time. The last 2 men to leave the ship had not survived, and were lowered respectfully, covered in sheets. They had succumbed to their injuries between the ship being stranded and the rescue of the men who were trapped in their beds. Now, only a crew of 125 men remained, and the Navy got to work trying to free the Northern Pacific, a task no one was entirely certain was possible. It would take 2 weeks, but finally, a fleet of tugboats was able to ease her off the sandbar and tow her to the New York Navy Yard, where it was found that she had been badly damaged by the waves. She would need many of her plates repaired. Her machinery was also no longer in working order, and her stern frame was cracked. The stern frame was considered the most problematic, and it would make the news when the Navy finally repaired it using a thermite weld, something that most people never even thought of. In July of 1919, she was returned to service and sent back to France to bring more men home. Her accommodations for her passengers had not improved. For that voyage, she brought 878 officers, 1,524 enlisted men, 8 civilians, 29 field clerks, 100 welfare workers, and 275 wounded soldiers. The officers who came back on her first voyage back in service went to the papers to report that some of them had been forced to sleep on mattresses on the deck and take their meals with the enlisted men. 300 officers, on seeing the conditions they would be traveling in, had refused to embark and were being detained in France charged with insubordination. The Northern Pacific would never again transport passengers in a civilian capacity. In August of 1919, the Northern Pacific was transferred to the Army Transport Service. She was returned to the shipping board on the 22nd of November 1921 and sold to the Pacific Steamship Company. On the 2nd of February 1922, while being towed to their yard, she caught fire and sank. She had narrowly missed ending her career on Fire Island, but in the end, fire had claimed her all the same. For more information, please see the Boston Globe from January 2nd, 1919, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.